All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into the world of professional photography,
Oh, yeah.
specifically the Fujifilm GFX 100S A camera.
Okay.
We have a really in-depth review from these photographers, Luke and Jade, who are professionals, and they've been testing this camera out for the last 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah, so they've really put it through its paces, shooting portraits, landscapes, architecture, all sorts of
Yeah,
things.
they've really put it through the ringer.
Exactly. And what we want to do today is kind of sift through all that info and bring you the key takeaways. Is this camera living up to the hype?
Right.
Is it something you should consider if you're, a serious photographer? And
Yeah.
one of the things we know going in is that the image quality is supposed to be just incredible.
Yeah.
And it has this coveted filmic look, which we'll get into.
Okay.
But it also has some quirks, like the design's been called brick-like,
Mm.
and the EVF is maybe not everyone's cup of tea. But
Yep.
before we jump into all that, let's sort of set the stage here. What makes this camera so unique?
So this is what's called a medium format camera,
Okay.
which means it's a significantly larger sensor than your typical full frame or APS-C sensor.
I see.
And this allows for exceptional image quality. So we're talking incredible detail, dynamic range, and that beautiful shallow depth of field
Yeah.
that makes your subject just pop. And the GFX 100S2 is aiming to bring that medium format power to more people with a price tag of $4,999,
Okay.
which is still it's a significant investment,
Yeah. Yeah.
but considerably less than some other medium format systems out there.
Okay, so impressive image quality at a relatively accessible price point.
Right.
But then we get to this brick-like description. Is it really as unwieldy as it sounds?
Well, the reviewers didn't actually find it to be too much of a hindrance.
Okay.
They said the size and weight are comparable to full-frame mirrorless cameras.
Huh.
And they even found it pretty comfortable to carry around for extended shoots.
So maybe not a literal brick, but it sounds like this camera is built for professionals.
Yeah.
What were some of the things in the review that hinted at that?
Well, Luke and Jade specifically called out the rugged build, the weather seals, and
Yeah.
that premium feel of
Yeah.
all the buttons and dials. These are features designed for photographers who really need a camera
Mm-hmm.
that can withstand kind of demanding conditions.
Makes sense.
And you could really tell that Fujifilm is catering to the professional who wants to tailor every little detail to their shooting experience with all the customization options they give you.
Customization is great, but, every camera has its quirks.
Of course.
What were some of the gripes that Luke and Jade had?
One thing they mentioned was the button layout.
Okay.
So if you're coming from another Fujifilm camera, and particularly an X-series camera,
Mm-hmm.
you might experience a bit of a learning curve with the GFX 100S2.
Interesting.
The placement of certain buttons just isn't consistent across Fujifilm's entire lineup.
Oh, so it's not standardized
Yeah.
across their cameras.
Yeah, so it could be frustrating for seasoned Fujifilm users.
So maybe not the most intuitive design for Fujifilm veterans, but can't they just remap the buttons?
Oh, for sure. That's
Yeah.
one of the great things about this camera. It's highly customizable.
Okay.
So you can set it up however you want. It might just take a little time to get everything dialed in.
All right, well, let's get to the big question here. Autofocus. How does the GFX 100 S2 perform in that department?
Okay.
I mean, it is a medium format camera, and traditionally, those haven't been known for lightning fast autofocus.
Right, that's true.
Yeah.
Autofocus has historically been a weak point for medium format cameras.
Yeah.
But Luke and Jade were both pleasantly surprised by the GFX 100S2's autofocus capabilities.
Really?
Yeah, they found it worked remarkably well for still photography,
Yeah.
particularly with features like the subject detection and the eye tracking, even in challenging shooting conditions.
That's good to hear. But they did say it might feel slow compared to other systems. Like, how big of an issue is that for the average photographer?
It really depends on your shooting style. If you're primarily a sports or wildlife photographer, speed is everything.
Right.
But if you're shooting portraits, landscapes, or even street photography, where you have a little more time to compose,
Yeah.
the autofocus on the GFX 100S2 should be perfectly adequate.
Okay, so maybe not a speed demon, but it sounds reliable enough for those genres where you have a little bit more breathing room.
Right.
Now let's talk about the part where this camera really shines, and that's image quality.
Yes.
Luke and Jade were just floored. They even used phrases like image-making powerhouse and an insane amount of editing latitude.
Wow.
So that's a pretty strong endorsement. What specifically were they impressed by?
It really goes beyond just the resolution, even though it's 102 megapixels.
Right.
What really sets this camera apart is the dynamic range.
Okay.
They were just blown away by the ability to capture detail
Yeah.
in both the deepest shadows and the brightest highlights.
Huh.
And it gives the image this incredible three-dimensional quality.
Oh, so that's what they mean by the filmic look.
Yes, exactly.
It's that ability to capture a wider range of tones.
Precisely. And we can't forget about Fujifilm's legendary color science.
Right.
They're known for their film simulations, which emulate the look of classic Fujifilm film stocks.
Right.
And the GFX 100S2 even includes a new film simulation called Reala Ace, which Luke raved about.
Oh, wow.
He said it was like having a whole new creative tool at his fingertips.
So I'm getting the sense that this camera really lets you capture your artistic vision. You know, it's not just about the technical specs.
For sure.
But even with all this praise, I'm sure there are some trade-offs. I mean, no camera is perfect.
Right.
What were some of the drawbacks that Luke and Jade highlighted?
One that immediately comes to mind is the EVF.
Okay.
Luke found it to be a bit sluggish.
In what way?
In terms of the refresh rate. So the image in the viewfinder doesn't update quite as smoothly as he'd like,
Oh, I see.
which made it a little bit tricky to track moving subjects.
Yeah.
And he also wasn't thrilled with the color accuracy of the EVF.
Right.
He said it didn't quite match what he saw in the final image.
Oh, so what you see isn't always what you get.
It's not always 100% representative, no.
Okay.
But
So maybe not the most immersive viewing experience then.
not quite.
Yeah.
But it's something to be aware of.
Is that a deal breaker though?
I think depends on the photographer.
Okay.
Some people might find the EVF's quirks to be a minor annoyance, while others might consider it a major drawback.
So it's all about weighing the pros and cons and figuring out what really matters most to you as a photographer.
Exactly.
Were there any other drawbacks that they talked about in the review?
They mentioned the button placement on the top plate being a bit awkward,
Okay.
particularly when you're trying to access them while looking through the EVF.
I see.
And then there's the issue of file size.
Hey.
I mean, 100 megapixel files are huge.
Yeah.
So you're going to need a lot of storage space and a pretty powerful computer to process them efficiently.
Yeah. The press of progress. So we have this camera with the amazing image quality, professional grade build customization options, but it's not without its quirks, namely that EVF and those massive file sizes.
Right.
What else did Luke and Jade uncover in their 6 months of testing? We'll dig into that right after this. So we talked about the EVF being a bit sluggish. How exactly did that manifest itself when Luke was using the camera?
It mostly had to do with the refresh rate.
Okay.
It means that the image in the viewfinder lags a little bit
Oh,
behind what's happening in real time.
I see.
So you can imagine if you're trying to track a moving subject.
Right, it takes you out of the moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can be a little frustrating. And then he was also concerned about the color accuracy, right?
Yeah, he said the colors in the EVF weren't always what he got in the final image.
Right, and that's actually a common issue with EVFs.
Oh, really?
The technology still has some limitations when it comes to replicating the full dynamic range and color accuracy that you get from the sensor.
So what you see isn't always what you get.
Yeah, it's not always 100% representative, but
Uh.
experienced photographers often use the EVF more as a compositional guide,
Right.
and then they'll double-check their exposure and colors using the histogram and by reviewing images on a calibrated monitor.
So you're saying it's more about understanding the limitations of the EVF
Exact.
and adjusting your workflow accordingly.
Yeah, and those massive 100 megapixel files we talked about,
Oh, yeah.
those also have implications for your workflow.
Right. I can only imagine.
So did they run into any issues with storage or processing those huge files?
They did. They really emphasize that you need to have a robust workflow to handle them.
Okay.
We're talking fast memory cards, lots of hard drive space, a computer with tons of RAM and processing power.
Wow. So it's not just about the camera.
It's about the whole ecosystem.
It's about the infrastructure
Right.
to support those high-resolution images.
So investing in the GFX 100S2 also means investing in a whole system to handle those files.
Pretty much, yeah. But for professionals who need that level of detail
Yeah.
and image quality, the benefits often outweigh the cost.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to some of the other features that make this camera stand out.
Okay.
The in-body image stabilization, the IBIS.
Yes.
Seems pretty groundbreaking. Luke was saying it offers up to 8 stops of compensation. Can you explain what that means? 8 stops sounds like a lot.
Is very impressive.
Huh.
So IBIS essentially counteracts camera shake.
I see.
So you can shoot at slower shutter speeds
Okay.
without introducing blur.
And that's good for what kind of situations?
It's particularly helpful in low light situations where
Gotcha.
you might not want to use a flash or increase your ISO too much.
Like if you're shooting indoors or something?
Exactly.
Okay.
Luke actually talked about using the IBIS to shoot handheld in a dimly lit cathedral,
Wow.
something that would have been nearly impossible without a tripod before.
Yeah, you would need a tripod for that.
But he was able to get these sharp images even at super slow shutter speeds, thanks to that 8 stops of compensation.
That's incredible. All right, so we know the autofocus isn't the fastest, but how did it perform in real-world shooting scenarios?
You know, Luke and Jade both found it to be perfectly capable for their needs.
Okay.
They said the subject detection and eye tracking were really reliable, particularly for portraits and slower-paced genres.
Do you think it would hold up in a more chaotic environment, like, shooting street photography or a busy event?
Luke actually tested it in Times Square,
Oh, wow.
which is about as chaotic as it gets.
Yeah.
And he was really impressed with how well the camera locked onto his subject's eyes, even with all the distractions and movement around him.
So it can handle it.
It seems like it can.
It's more about accuracy than just pure speed.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
For a
Yep.
camera like this, it makes sense.
It's about being deliberate with your shots.
Right.
What about burst shooting speed? Can the GFX 100S handle action at all?
It's not a speed demon, but it has been improved from its predecessor. The GFX 100S2 can shoot up to 7 frames per second using the mechanical shutter.
So that's not bad.
It's not going to compete with like a sports or wildlife camera,
Right.
but it's enough to capture a sequence of moments
Yeah.
and choose the best frame.
So for things like dance or street photography, where there's movement, but it's not, super high speed,
Right.
it would probably be fine. What else caught your eye in terms of features?
There's this pixel shift multi-shot mode that I found really interesting.
Okay.
So it's a technique where the camera takes multiple images of the same scene, each with a slightly shifted sensor position.
So it's kind of like taking a panorama, but you're getting like a super high resolution image.
It's similar. Yeah, the software then uses the information from each shot to create a final image
Okay.
with crazy detail and resolution,
How high are we talking?
up to 400 megapixels.
400 megapixels. That's wild. What are the downsides of this mode, though?
The main thing is that it only works with static subjects.
I-
So if there's any movement in the scene, it's going to cause problems in the final image.
Right. It's not going to work for every situation.
Exactly. So it's best for things like architecture, still life, or product photography.
Yay, where you need that crazy level of detail.
Right.
Okay, so it's a niche feature, but incredibly powerful in the right situations. All right, let's talk about video capabilities.
Okay.
We know that the GFX 100S2 can shoot 4K video at up to 30 frames per second. Is that considered high quality these days?
4K is definitely the standard for high-quality video.
Okay.
30 frames per second is a very common frame rate for that cinematic look.
Okay.
The GFX 100S2 also offers features like professional codecs, like ProRes, the ability to record externally to an SSD,
Okay.
and even advanced features like F-Log recording,
Wow.
which gives you way more dynamic range to work with in post-production.
So they've really thought about the video features here.
They haven't just slapped it on as an afterthought.
Yeah. Would you say it's a viable option for professional videographers?
I think it depends on what they need.
Okay.
Dedicated cinema cameras offer even higher resolutions and frame rates.
Sure.
And more features, specifically designed for filmmaking.
Of course.
But for photographers who occasionally need to capture video,
Mm-hmm.
or for hybrid shooters who want a camera that can do both stills and video well,
Right.
the GFX 100S2 is definitely a solid choice.
It's a versatile camera.
It is.
We keep coming back to this filmic look that Luke and Jade talked about.
Right.
You said it's a combination of factors, including that larger sensor and Fujifilm's film simulations.
Right.
Can any photographer achieve that look with this camera, or does it take a certain level of skill and artistic vision?
A skilled photographer can create compelling images with any camera.
Right.
The camera is just a tool.
Right.
It's how you use it that matters.
Right, of course.
But the GFX 100S2 does give you a really powerful set of tools that lend themselves to that cinematic aesthetic.
Right.
That shallow depth of field, the beautiful color rendition, the way it handles light and shadow. It all contributes to that look.
It's like the camera's giving you a head start,
I think so.
but you still need that photographer's eye to compose the shot, to
Exactly.
tell the story and capture the emotion.
The GFX 100S2 gives you the canvas and the brushes,
I love that.
but you're the artist.
That's a great analogy. So we've covered a lot of ground here with the GFX 100S2, from the impressive image quality to the EVF quirks and those massive file sizes.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think overall, how does it stack up against the competition?
You know, what really stands out to me is that this camera is really designed for a specific type of photographer,
Right.
someone who values image quality above all else
Yeah.
and is willing to invest in the ecosystem that's needed to support it.
It's not for the casual user.
Exactly.
And I think that's a great segue into our final segment. It seems like with this GFX 100S2 medium format is becoming more and more accessible.
Yeah, it's definitely pushing in that direction.
Do you think it's going mainstream?
Well, I think it's making medium format more accessible, like you said, both in terms of price and usability.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still a specialized tool. You know,
Right.
it has those strengths like the image quality and the medium format look, but it also comes with compromises,
Right.
like the huge file sizes and the quirks that we talked about.
So it's not going to replace our everyday cameras anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. It's full frame and APS-C cameras
Yeah.
still offer fantastic performance and versatility
Right.
at a wider range of prices,
For sure.
and they're generally smaller and lighter,
Yeah.
more suited for fast-paced shooting.
Makes sense.
The GFX 100S isn't trying to be everything to everyone.
Right.
It's really about giving more options to photographers
Mm-hmm.
who are looking for that next level of image quality
Yeah.
and that distinct medium format look.
Well, we keep coming back to that filmic look.
Right.
You know, you mentioned it's a combination of factors, the larger sensor, the film simulations.
Yeah.
Do you think any photographer can achieve that look with this camera, or does it take a certain level of skill and artistic vision?
You know, a skilled photographer can create great images with any camera.
Right.
The camera's just a tool.
Right.
It's how you use it.
Right, of course.
But the GFX 100S2 does provide a really powerful set of tools
Mm-hmm.
that lend themselves to that look.
Right.
The shallow depth of field, the color, the way it handles light and shadow.
It all works together.
It does.
It's like the camera's giving you a head start, but you still need the photographer's eye to bring it all together.
The GFX 100S2 gives you the canvas and the brushes, but you're the artist.
I love that analogy so much.
A good one.
I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. You know, the review we talked about focused mainly on still photography,
Right.
but this camera can shoot 4K video too.
It can.
What do you think videographers would make of the GFX 100S2? What kind of possibilities does it open up?
That's a great question. Imagine that shallow depth of field and those film simulations
Yeah,
applied to video footage.
that would be pretty cool.
And with features like ProRes recording and F-Log,
Right.
it could be really powerful for professional video work.
I'd love to see what filmmakers could do with this camera.
Me too.
I think this deep dive has really given us a lot to consider.
I think so.
Not just about this camera, but about photography in general.
For sure. You know, it's all about finding the tools that inspire you and help you create the work you want to make.
That's great advice.
The GFX 100S2 might be the perfect tool for some people, but it's not the only path to great photography.
Right.
Keep exploring, keep experimenting, and keep pushing your own creative boundaries.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Fujifilm GFX 100S2.
That's it.
Hope you enjoyed the journey.
I did.